Welcome, everyone. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of Mercy One Cancer Center and the founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our weekly cancer education series. It's brought to you in part by a grant from the Iowa Oncology Society. And our topic this evening is the healing power of poetry. And our guest tonight is Susanna DeBaca. Welcome, Susanna.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Susanna is the CEO of Business Publications Corporation, and that's the corporation that publishes, among other publications, the Business Record and DSN Magazine. And in addition to being the CEO of Business Publications, Susanna is also a poet and an author. So we're really excited to have a conversation about poetry tonight.
Well, thank you for having me on your show.
Before we talk about poetry, though, we want to get to know the poet. So tell us a bit about yourself. Where were you born and where did you go to school?
Well, I'm a native Iowan. I was born in Ames and I grew up in Huxley, Iowa. So it's a tiny town that I think had 500 people then and 4,000 now. And after a long circuitous path, I lived there again.
Wow.
In my hometown.
And were you a city kid or a farm girl?
I was a farm girl. My parents had a cattle breeding operation. So that's for another podcast.
Yes.
Some of my skills. But I went to undergraduate school at Iowa State and I studied art and design.
Okay. So back to high school.
Yes.
What was your claim to fame was it called Huxley High?
It was called Ballard High. Go Bombers.
Ballard High.
Yes.
Okay. What was your
Bombers.
claim to fame in high school?
Well, I was involved in all sorts of things, but I would say my claim to fame was truly I was the editor of the school newspaper.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent.
And I was in band and drama, all the arts. I was a pretty mediocre athlete,
Okay.
very good student.
So what instrument did you play in the band?
I played alto sax, but I can play every woodwind
Oh,
instrument.
wow. And were you in the marching band?
Of course.
Yeah.
I got out of that by being a cheerleader, though.
Okay. And then what role on stage during high school are you most proud of?
I was Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker. And
Wow.
yes, I took it so seriously. I practiced being blind for a week to have developed the empathy. I was very bruised, but we felt that we were professional actors.
Wow. And how about an editorial that you wrote in high school that you're most proud of?
I can't believe I remember these things, but the ABCs of Ronald Reagan, I wrote an entire, like 3 pages kind of outlining his policies using the alphabet.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
And then do you remember, did you publish any poetry in high school?
I had poetry in some local papers and things like that. Yes.
So even in grade school or high school, you were writing poems?
Absolutely. Started writing poetry and essays in probably elementary school and junior high.
What is the first poem that you remember that was part of your consciousness, other than nursery rhymes? Like once grade school, junior high, high school, what's one of the first poems that you remember that maybe was part of you falling in love with poetry?
Well, I think many people remember Robert Frost's poem, Everything Green is Gold. That was part of The Outsiders. It sort of became famous because of The Outsiders. So I loved Robert Frost, but our family read a lot of poetry. And even in junior high, I was reading a lot of feminist poetry. An aunt who was a literature professor and gave us all sorts of subversive things.
Yeah, mine wasn't so subversive. I think one of the first ones I remember, just the language and it was Casey at the Bat. And then I remember The Highwayman as in sort of, both of those are more classic with rhymes, but really fun to recite.
We did a lot of French poetry in junior high and high school in our French class too. So I can actually, to this day, recite some poems in French, even if I don't remember exactly what they mean. Rimbaud.
Ballard, pretty progressive.
Ballard, hi, yes.
French poetry in French.
Who knew?
Wow. Well, we might get to having you recite in French, but so then college. So Iowa State, you get selected to go to Iowa State. What was your first major at Iowa State?
Well, I actually started at U of I, and my major was drawing, painting, and printmaking and journalism. And then I transferred to Iowa State for a ill-fated love relationship. This is how we pick
Okay.
academics.
That's how a poet would do that.
A poet would do that. Followed the guy, broke up with him. but
Chemistry
stayed at-
major would not transfer schools.
Stayed at Iowa State, yes. So my major there was drawing, painting, printmaking on art history. And then I was in the honors program and they let me design kind of my own thing. So I also did religious studies, anthropology, and philosophy because I was apparently determined never to get a job at all.
Wow.
Yes.
And then what did you do when you graduated with a bachelor's degree with that much
Well,
knowledge?
originally I thought I would go to graduate school, but I was broke. And so I got a job running a nonprofit, which didn't help much. And I still thought I was going to go into the arts. And a couple of board members at this nonprofit, which was a organization in Dallas that explored the convergence of science and religion. It was really fascinating. It was
right.
docs from Southwest Medical School and Perkins School of Theology professors came together, and we would invite Nobel laureates in the physical sciences to come talk about meaning and consciousness.
Yeah.
Anyway, pretty mind-blowing.
Like Krista Tippett on Being,
Exactly.
Or Fetzger Institute. What was the name of the not-for-profit?
It's called the Isthmus Institute.
Oh, okay.
And Larry Dossey was the founder of it, and he was a very famous space, time, and medicine. He wrote a lot of.
That must have been fascinating.
It was amazing. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then, ironically, a couple of these board members who were businessmen sat me down one day and said, "We don't think you should get an art degree. We think you should get an MBA. And we think you should apply to Harvard Business School," which was the funniest thing I had ever heard in my life, because as you can tell, no road was leading to that.
Yeah. And what did you do?
I applied and got in.
So I did not know this about you. So you have an MBA from Harvard Business School.
I do. It had been a near miss between getting a PhD in art history, massage therapy school, or an MBA from Harvard. And so I went to Harvard.
And you went there in person.
Yes.
Yes. It was not an online class.
No, this is
Right.
pre-online.
So you went to Cambridge.
I went to Cambridge.
And you got an MBA. And then what was your first job after you got your MBA?
Well, I was still determined to go into the arts. And I had a job at a big museum that fell through. So I actually accidentally ended up getting a job in investment management.
Okay.
So I have a very odd career, right? I did not plan on being, in that field. But I was managing money for an organization that oversaw foundations and endowments. So it's still kind of art related. And I was doing portfolio management as well as developing business. And then I was recruited by some investment managers who did private client work with individuals. And so I moved to New York, and I lived there for many years and worked on Wall Street doing investment management for ultra high net worth families and foundations and institutions.
And did you bring poetry into conversations with families? So I imagine as you're doing investment management, you're also getting to know families kind of philosophically. And I just think of relationships that I know between investment advisors and clients, and it can become almost a counseling beyond just
100%.
What's the highest rate of return we're going to get?
Yes. I had continued to paint, have art shows, write, and I didn't make any secret of that. One of the firms I first worked for was a company called Neuberger Berman, and the founder was he was a major art collector. We had art all over the office, and oftentimes the families that we were helping had an interest in the arts. They were doing philanthropy, in their communities around the humanities or arts.
Mhm.
And so we did have a lot of conversations that were about what they were wanting to achieve with their money or with their philanthropy. And so the arts were often part of that conversation. Mhm.
Okay. So let's shift to poetry. So the tonight's topic is the healing power of poetry. What does even that phrase mean, and why, when you think about poetry and what poetry has done for you, and when you have been, because we've been on a stage together and sharing poetry, what do you think it is about poetry that has the power to be soothing, healing, or what other positive phrases you might use?
Mhm. Well, I think initially for me, writing poetry was a form of self-expression that was healing to me personally, right? I was able to um, express myself, look at the world, try to interpret it, make sense of it. Not that I ever have, but attempting
Mhm.
to observe and create some order or some observations. As a reader of poetry, similar, right? I think we often read poetry to open our minds, to look at the world in new ways, but poetry has the power to inspire, to soothe, as you mentioned, maybe sometimes even to provoke, right?
Mhm.
To help you realize, oh, I'm not looking at this in the right way, or there are other ways of looking at things. So I would say any art form has the power to help an individual really to speak to their soul in a way that more logic or facts
Mhm.
do not.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Do you think that there's the fact that it tends to be a bit more oblique than reading the newspaper, that it requires more attention, and that there's a component of mind that doesn't happen when we're reading the newspaper and listening to the radio at the same time, and TV's on? And
Yeah, unlike just news reporting or nonfiction or fiction, where you're just reading the words and there's a story, poetry is really trying to convey a message or convey a story, but in a much more vague way, using rhythm, using repetition, using different kinds of devices that really, are rhythmic sometimes. So that triggers sort of a different part of your brain. I think we hear and interpret poetry differently than we do other types of writing. But more than anything, it leaves a lot to the reader,
Mhm.
right? It gives you the chance to make meaning out of what you're reading that may be very, very different than what somebody else
Mhm.
takes from that poem.
And I love the way you describe both the healing power of writing poetry, the healing power of reading poetry. I would say there's also a difference in terms of the healing power, perhaps, of reciting poetry,
Mhm.
and the healing power not just of reading poetry, but maybe of listening to poetry, to listen to someone else. So all of those are a bit different, but they all have the ability to be healing in different ways. In the world, in music and in art, and I don't know that we actually have a certified poetry therapist, but we do have medically certified art therapists and medically certified music therapists that are certified in counseling, but use music or art as part of their counseling experience with a client.
Mhm.
Um, I think that other humanities have those healing powers, but we haven't quite medicalized them into a certification process of being a poetry therapist. There might be such a thing as a dance therapist, though. Where,
Maybe we can invent
yeah,
this.
yeah, we can. Poetry
Mhm.
therapy.
Poetry
Okay.
therapy
So
started here.
why
Mhm.
don't you give us an example of
Mhm.
one of your poems that you want to share with us?
Okay. I brought a couple, but I thought I'd start with one that I did not write about cancer. However, when I published this, several people interpreted it as I had. That's what spoke to them. So this poem is called All Sides of You. Holiest one, child among us, you are born yourself, holy yourself. Holiest one, child among us, the divine in you is formless, but you enter the world in a body, compartmentalized, constrained. We all enter the battlefield alone, drawing on all our attributes, our faith, our flesh, our rage, our hope, our courage. Your spirit transforms you into a warrior, arms outstretched, hands extended. Do not surrender. Do not give up. Do not lay down. We are here, visible and invisible, imperfect, fighting with you, for you, surrounding you together, all sides of us together.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, I as a cancer doctor, I can't hear that without thinking that this is someone who is facing that sort of a challenge in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was very meaningful to me when a friend of mine who was a cancer survivor saw the poem and said, "Oh, this really spoke to me in my journey."
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. I said, "Well, that's great."
You know, it also makes me think with Above and Beyond Cancer, we often talk about how do you take a bump in the road of life and use it as a springboard, not a barrier. You know, as a cancer doctor in leading a cancer survivorship organization, the bump we're talking about mostly is cancer, but philosophically, that bump in life, whatever it is that this person is facing that feels that they have to fight, it doesn't matter what the bump is philosophically. It's how do we muster our own strength and collectively the strength of those around us to approach whatever obstacle it is with hope and optimism.
Indeed. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a particular bump or obstacle or opponent that prompted you to write this particular poem?
This poem came about. I have a habit of doing news prompt poems. So I'll read the news, and if something strikes me, I have to say hi.
Oh, wow.
Hi, yes.
Our live studio audience is expanding.
Growing. Yes,
It's growing.
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, sometimes if a headline hits me, I'll write something about this. And this poem emerged when there were a lot of bills in the legislature around trans people. And the phrase "holiest one, child among us" just came up in my brain, and that's how that poem came about. But again, it's the bump in the road. It's the attack on you because of your flesh, whether it's external or internal. That I think that was what my friend responded to.
There was one part early in the poem, and I almost want to look over and look because there's holy, HOLY, but then there was a time I was wondering whether you were referring to whole, WHO.
Yes, holy yourself. Yes.
And is it WH?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's both ways.
There's both ways. So I did hear that, and I was wondering whether,
Mhm.
and that's one thing where, you know, that the way things sound can be different than the way they look on a page. And so the experience might be different just listening to that to reading it with those two words and which words are you using?
Exactly. Good. Okay.
Okay, let's go to another one. I can't wait to hear some more.
Okay. Well, since it's I'll do one that is well, I won't preface it. I'll just read it. Okay. This poem is called Tenderness. There is never just one loss. Despair inhabits the body, like being slammed against a wall or held underwater. The delicate and fleeting objects among us are so easily broken. An iridescent bubble floating in the air, a gossamer spider web stretching between leaves, the vulnerable peony's flushed petals here and gone in the blink of an eye, the icy snowflake melting like a cool tear on your cheek, the flutter of a butterfly, a floating ash. Be gentle, as with a newborn, as with an egg. Cup the warm round shell of your heart in the palm of your hand while you transport it to a place of safety.
Yeah, we're fragile. And and everyone has a bag of rocks, and we have to be gentle with ourselves. So those are some of the thoughts that I have as I'm listening to the words. Don't have the advantage of many time a poem like that I would read more than once to kind of first time through, and then you might think of something that the first stanza might have meant something different and go back. So
Yeah.
what were you thinking as you wrote it?
Well, I think it's about grief. It's very much about grief and how losses happen, but we feel them in our body. You can lose someone or lose something, and it's physical, right? And so, as you're saying, it's about the fragility and taking care with yourself while you heal. So it could be about your own disease. It could also be about an external loss, but the cupping the warm round shell of your heart while you transport it, sort of your emotions and your soul are very sacred. Treat them carefully,
Yeah. And some of the initially I was thinking there's impermanence and transient nature of some of the things, where there's the falling leaf or the
peony here and gone.
Yeah, there we go. Yes. And that and that is the way of nature. We are mortal, and things come and go, and it's not surprising that in some cultures, and I might get this a bit wrong, but in the Hindu culture, the creator and the destroyer are the same, and that you can't have creation without destruction, and that they are one in the same process.
Indeed. Exactly. Do you want to hear one that's more literal about the
Yes.
cancer experience?
Yes.
Okay. So this is one I wrote in the last year, very specifically for a person, or when a person had been diagnosed, and it's called Last Words. When you were first diagnosed, we said, "Oh, I had an uncle who died of that." Only we didn't say he died. We said he had the same type of cancer. But we were projecting, keyboards pounding out your final days, your last words as we imagined them. When you told people your news, they were incredulous and said they had an aunt, a sister, a friend, a colleague, a neighbor who had beaten it, like it was a competitor in a road race or something to be crushed with a hammer. They all knew someone who'd fought it valiantly, like a foe in a jousting competition, or like a starving lion attacking in the dark. And in our care, we believed you should listen to us, as if our stories would give you hope, but you didn't want to hear our stories. It was your process, you said, your life. When you told us it was inoperable, we blinked and turned away so you couldn't see the full impact of the blow, so you couldn't hear the thunderclap in our chests as we realized there was no escaping, no frame of reference, no platitudes, no comparisons that would fix it all. We tried to hide our despair and sorrow, but it still spilled out in a mess of all the wrong words. Finally, we had to trust that your story was your story, and that your ending would come the way it unfolded.
Wow. That is so powerful. I just relate to that in so many ways. You're right. It's very literal. I think everyone can understand it, and but the language and the back and forth, because clearly you are experiencing in a very different way, but very emotionally and viscerally, this anticipatory loss that you're going to experience.
Yes, and I think everyone experiences their own illness so differently. Some people want to talk about fighting, and this was my closest friend who died last November after a very quick, experience with pancreatic cancer, and she didn't want anyone to use those kinds of words. She didn't want to hear about anyone else's story. This was her life, right? And so then we didn't know what to say. and all we could do was listen, right?
Hmm.
So it was a very powerful experience for all of us in trying to figure out how to support her and to manage our own grief.
And you bring up a very important point, is the metaphors we use to describe the cancer journey. And in America, we often phrase everything from the Olympics to an illness as a fight and a battle. And there unfortunately are winners and losers. And when you are on a journey with incurable cancer, the idea of a battle with winners and losers is not soothing.
No. And to her, she said, I'm accepting. I am
Mhm.
accepting, and I want to have a peaceful
Yeah.
death. And these metaphors are upsetting.
Yeah. So, what metaphors might be more comforting to someone with incurable cancer? For some, the fight is kind of what they go to, I think, more just out of a habit, because that's what we talk about. They lost the battle. Whereas what probably happens more is more of a symbiotic, that the cancer is actually part of us, and that individuals with stage 4 incurable cancer, it's how can you and your cancer peacefully coexist? And it's a little bit like a dance. And sometimes you step on its toes, and sometimes it steps on your toes, but you are inextricably bound together on this journey. And it's more of a walk or a dance than it is a fight.
Mm-hmm. A walk together.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to share a fairly literal poem about cancer by another poet.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very published, prominent poet named Mary Oliver.
I'm honored to be on the bill with her.
And I'm not sure her poem is better than yours, but it is different. And she survived her first bout of cancer, and then unfortunately, like many people, having one cancer doesn't make you immune to another. And she did die of her second cancer. This was written after she was diagnosed with her first cancer. And the title is even kind of a work of art. The title is The Fourth Sign of the Zodiac. And it should make you think, oh, what's the fourth sign of the zodiac? And the fourth sign of the zodiac is cancer. So it's titled The Fourth Sign of the Zodiac. And if you're perceptive enough, you might know what it's about from the beginning. And it's written in 4 parts. So this is Mary Oliver's The Fourth Sign of the Zodiac. Part 1. Why should I have been surprised? Hunters walk the forest without a sound. The hunter strapped to his rifle, the fox on his feet of silk, the serpent on his empire of muscles, all move in a stillness, hungry, careful, intent, just as the cancer entered the forest of my body without a sound. Part 2. The question is, what will it be like after the last day? Will I float into the sky, or will I fray within the earth or a river, remembering nothing? How desperate I would be if I couldn't remember the sun rising, if I couldn't remember trees, rivers, if I couldn't even remember, beloved, your beloved name. Part 3. I know you never intended to be in this world, but you're in it all the same. So why not get started immediately? I mean, belonging to it. There's so much to admire, to weep over, to write music or poems about. Bless the feet that take you to and fro. Bless the eyes and the listening ears. Bless the tongue, the marvel of taste. Bless touching. You could live 100 years. It's happened or not. I'm speaking from the fortunate platform of many years, none of which I think I've ever wasted. Do you need a prod? Do you need a little darkness to get you going? Let me be urgent as a knife then, and remind you of Keats, so single of purpose and thinking for a while he had a lifetime. Part 4. Late yesterday afternoon in the heat, all the fragile blue flowers in bloom in the shrubs in the yard next door had tumbled from the shrubs and lay wrinkled and fading in the grass. But this morning, the shrubs were full of the blue flowers again. There wasn't a single one on the grass. How, I wondered, did they roll back up the branches, that fiercely wanting, as we all do, just a little more of life? So one of the things I really
I'm snapping. I'm
Thank
snapping
you,
for Mary
thank
Oliver.
you. Yeah. It's kind of 4 different philosophical, and it's almost like it takes someone through those stages of facing something difficult. I mean, there's the surprise and shock of entered the body without a sound. Then there's like jumping to, I'm going to die someday. What's it going to be like after I'm dead? And then this little like, get yourself up
Going.
and going. Do you need a little prod?
Mhm.
It's memento mori. Remember, you're going to die someday. You're not dead today. What are you going to do today? And then finally, this sort of universal, don't we all just want just a little more of life?
Mhm. So beautiful. She's the most amazing poet.
Yeah, that is.
Another poet, I don't have anything of hers here, but who had a cancer journey that she wrote a lot about was Audre Lorde.
Okay, I do not know that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that might be one for people to look into.
Okay.
Mhm.
What else do you have of your poetry?
Well, let's see if I should. Here's a similar one then, maybe if we talk about kind of the thinking about meaning, called Remember the Bees. When you feel you cannot carry the load even one more day, remember the bee. There she is today, lighting on the dahlia and the daisy, swarming on the sunflower, darting from space to place, collecting pollen. The task of the worker bee is to gather food. She lands on a flower, wets the dry pollen with juices from her mouth, packs it onto the stiff hairs of her hind legs. She packs her pollen basket until it is full. Is she exhausted from her labor? Do her tiny wings ache when she returns to the hive? The bee flits from bloom to bloom. She does not know she is pollinating, that she's transcendent. She is simply gathering, working. She is weary from the weight of her precious cargo, but she keeps flying and packing, part of a miracle yet to be revealed, a blossom yet to unfold.
Beautiful. So tell me a bit about the experience of writing that. So you somehow, come up with the idea of the bee. Then there's a part where you name different flowers. And so you've got a very large choice of which flowers to choose. Do the way the words, how many syllables, what letters they start with, what they sound like. I mean, you probably chose different flowers and you decided how many flowers you're going to list. You could have gone on for 2 more stanzas of just listing flowers. Even like, how did that part of writing it come about?
Well, I'm obsessed with bees. I love bees. They just have so many lessons for us about how they live their entire life. Did you know there are even mortuary bees? There are bees in their cycle where their function is to clear the dead out of the hive. They pick them up and they move them away, knowing someday someone will do the same. Look, there's a honeycomb on that right there. Yes. Anyway, so I spend a lot of time watching and thinking about bees, and the idea that the bee has a job like anyone, but doesn't actually understand how much bigger their meaning is in the universe. That was what was striking me and going through my mind. And this was a much, much longer poem. And I often write and then I cut down, both for, someone described it to me one time as removing the scaffolding and trying to find the core of the poem. So here's the excess words. Let's get rid of them. Let's try to find what's holding it up. Then I might tinker around with, there's some alliteration or something like that. Right. But that's kind of how it works. It's construction, poem construction.
And deconstruction.
Yeah. And sometimes you deconstruct too much. You're like, oh, well, okay, the pow went out of that.
Right.
You know, put that one back.
Yeah. Because obviously poetry, as opposed to writing a novel, is all about how do you get an idea across in a very few number of words.
Yes. Then this may have been too literal. I have poet friends that are always like, show, 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 stop telling. Right.
But it is, I've often thought of a writing a screenplay that's something like this, where you focus in on, let's say, the bees or the ants sort of doing their things, and then you widen your scope to bring the humans in and then they're doing their things that's sort of oblivious to the bigger part, and then you bring in the whole universe. And just as the bees are oblivious to the division of labor and what they are really creating, we humans think that we're everything, and we lose sight of the fact we're part of a bigger universe,
a much bigger universe.
But then to the final scene is how far out you go, and is there something else controlling?
Well, look at Mary Oliver. She's doing that, where her last punch is essentially bringing you back to your role and part in nature. That the flowers, are trying to bloom one more day, right? That
they're no different than we are,
right? And we are no different than them.
Yes. Wonderful. Let's go with another poem.
Okay. Well, let's see. I can give you. You want inspiration? Do you want?
I want whatever you would like to share with us as a poet. I just love.
Okay, I will actually go all the way to death now. Okay. This was a poem that was actually another news prompt poem. Something else brought it up, but I received a lot of very positive reinforcement. So it's called "I Pray You Leave Us Gently." A gentle death, taken in the night, in a deep sleep, slipping away in a warm haze, song of crickets and bullfrogs vibrating in your ears as you drift off. This is what I wish for you, a painless crossing. Not to feel the heat of wildfires, the panic of floodwaters, the sharp shock of a drone attack. Not to be blindsided by an accident, face the devastation of disease or decay day after day. Because I loved you, I wished you a gentle life, but only flowers unfold gracefully, wither reliably. You came into this world in a fog of labor, crying and gasping, the passage of torment. We live as we enter, struggling, grabbing at happiness, gulping lungfuls of air and affection. Who among us can prevent hurt, defy nature's fury? You had your share of sorrow, injustice, a jagged journey of joy and injury. Who knows how we will end, but even the easy deaths I've witnessed go hard in the last moments, in a violent rush of breath, a rattle before stillness. But still, I pray you leave us gently, carried on a soft breeze after dusk, moving lightly in shadow, breathing the roundness of the moon, smelling the ripeness of the cornfields, perfume of the flocks in the yard, the warmth of care on your skin and your bones, erasing the suffering, delivering you delicately as a petal falls, slowly, silently to the ground, a whisper, imperceptible and gone.
That is beautiful. Before we talk about it, I want to share two other poets about death. And first, I want to ask, when you use the word gently, are you making a reference to another poem? Do you know if you're making a reference?
I do not.
Okay.
You have another poem that
yeah, so this is a poem that's a very famous poem about death that is not as comforting as what you have just described, but it's a very famous poem about death, and it's Dylan Thomas.
Do not go.
Do not go
Gently.
gentle into that good night. So compare the soothing aspect of that to do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And it goes on and on. But do not go gentle. Don't give up. Rage, rage against the light. But of course, he was 30 something when he wrote this. And then compare that. So I would never read this poem to a patient of mine that is, going through incurable cancer and entering this phase of death. But I would share with them this poem by John O'Donohue called Entering Death. I pray that you will have the blessing of being consoled and sure about your death. May you know in your soul there is no need to be afraid. When your time comes, may you have every blessing and strength you need. May there be a beautiful welcome for you in the home you are going to. You're not going somewhere strange, merely back to the home you've never left. May you live with compassion and transfigure everything negative within and about you. When you come to die, may it be after a long life. May you be tranquil among those who care for you. May your going be sheltered and your welcome assured. May your soul smile in the embrace of your Anam Cara, which is Gaelic for soul friend. So that's a poem that I have shared with patients and families on a deathbed. And Dylan Thomas is more famous and it is dramatic, but it's sure not comforting.
No, not comforting. And I can't believe I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, that's
because it's
the
a
first
very
thing.
famous
Yeah,
poem.
and when you started off with the gently, I'm going, oh, this is juxtaposed. There is a little bit of tension in yours, though, in that the poet says, "I've never seen a gentle death." So even though they're wishing this one they care about a gentle death, they admit they've never seen a gentle death. Wait, where did that come from?
I've never seen a gentle death.
Okay.
Yes, I've seen.
I have.
Yes, and I think there are. I have heard about, a friend of mine died in his sleep. Now his journey was not gentle, but his death was. But the ones I have witnessed at the very end have been as I describe it, right?
So, and even as I'm listening, and then,
you want me to edit it for you?
Then it's like, wait, I don't know that I want to share this telling somebody as I'm reading it. I've never witnessed a gentle death. It's always just really bad at the end.
And footnoting, that just always ruins the moment.
But that's I'm trying to make pragmatic utilitarian use of your art.
Well, I will try to find some of my more gentle death poems. Yes. So we're gonna have you share one more before we open it up to questions. But before we do that, tell us a bit more about. So you're a visual artist, a painter. You probably do other things artistic. Do you consider yourself primarily a poet or an artist? And are there things that you get out of doing visual arts that you don't get out of poetry? When do you maybe sit down and decide I want to make some visual art? And when do you sit down and decide you want to craft a piece of art with words? As a younger person, I really considered myself a visual artist more because I did more art and had more time for art, and I did poetry, but I would have introduced myself as an artist. Now I feel very multifaceted, but I have less time for visual arts. I still feel that I am an artist, but poetry has a much bigger part in my life, in part because it's been possible to fit in, right, in a different way. But they do very different things. Visual art is, I mean, you don't have words, right? You're trying to convey a story or a feeling just through imagery, and so you don't get all the verbs, right? And what someone sees in a piece of art could be completely different. I do both abstract and figurative work. A poem, because you are using words which are so powerful, it's a very different kind of responsibility, right?
Mhm.
And you agonize over word choice very differently. In a painting, you're rebuilding or you're cutting down, and so it's similar process, but very, very different
Yeah.
kind of expression.
And from the poetry that you've shared so far, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but it seems like there is a meaning that you're intending, and that it's very accessible to us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not the same as a piece written in a newspaper, but when you create this, let's say, abstract art, do you expect a viewer that doesn't know you or or only sees your art to get their own experience, or do you expect that what you put into it is something that a stranger looking at it is going to get out of it?
I think early on, I thought people would get what I was doing. And then I learned, no, oftentimes it was 360, where it was like, wow, where did you get that? But fine, that's your takeaway, right?
Mhm.
If you see that in this painting, that's where you are, right? So it's really fascinating and actually incredibly rewarding if someone takes it in a very different direction,
Mhm.
right? I think the feedback I get is a lot of my poetry is pretty literal and accessible. Some people say, oh, I like your poetry because I understand it, as opposed to really obscure poetry. Well, I also have a lot of obscure poetry, but I just don't show it to everybody,
Yeah.
right? So different. And the things that I chose here, I thought were relevant, whereas I have a lot of other very feminist poetry, or, things that have different kinds of expression.
Yes.
Mhm, mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
Well, we'll have you share another poem with us, whatever you would like, and then we're going to open it up to questions.
Okay, I'll read one more called I Forgot There Were Stars. I forgot there were stars because I was looking straight ahead. Shining street lamps, glaring headlights, the noise of traffic and sirens, the smell of exhaust. I forgot there were stars because I was looking to the left and right, head down, focused on facts, screens blinking, paper in my hand, breaking news like rushing water, in meetings, in the grocery store, pumping gas, loading laundry, scurrying like an ant, urgently moving crumbs, spinning in circles. But then one cold winter night, I saw them, so dark, so quiet as I walked along the path. The screech of an owl pierced me, and I fell headlong into the blackness of the midnight sky. The constellations held me. For a split second, my life unfolded. Moments I had shoved down so deep I could not feel them anymore came rushing up. All the loss, longing, doubt, and joys I had dismissed. The mystery of an eclipse, a hawk slowly gliding against the cloud, the silence after a snowfall, freshly cut hayfields. I inhaled and exhaled and was overcome with stillness. Then the heavens threw me back and whispered, "Look up."
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Let's open it up to questions. If you're watching us live streaming, there's a comment section. You can put your question in and we will address it to Susanna. And we've got a live studio audience. So we'll start with the audience here in the room.
Do you ever write poetry for weddings? like for bride and groom or for anniversaries?
Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, yes, I've written many wedding poems. Yeah, and funeral poems.
Yes.
Never an anniversary, but I'm open.
And so, do you do commissions, or these are for friends or do you do, like if you're going to do a wedding poem, it's usually specifically for someone, the bride or the groom, or do you do them just in general?
I have never been commissioned by strangers to write a
Okay.
poem for a wedding. However, I've often been invited to read or speak at a wedding, and then I've said, "Would you be open to me writing a poem?" And people tend to like that.
Yes.
I read the poem about the gentle death, the not so gentle death, and in fact,
At a wedding?
no.
Okay. Okay, good. Good.
I published that poem, and I got a call from a woman named Emily Mendez, who's the development director at Proteus, which is a nonprofit for farm workers. And she asked if I would write a poem, an homage to fallen farm workers for a gala, which I did not ask for money for. But so I've had people ask me to write things for specific occasions, and that felt like such an honor.
Yeah.
That I was
Wow.
like, wow, that's hard. Okay.
And do you have a funeral poem with you that you wrote specifically because you were asked to speak at a funeral and you wrote something?
I don't have a poem that I read at a funeral, but I do have a poem that I think is funerally. Would you
Okay.
want me to read
Yeah.
it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Funerally, is that a word? I
yeah.
don't think so. Okay. This is a poem called There's a Church in the Clearing That Looks Like a Tree. A cottonwood towering over the dry creek bed, centuries old, carved in half by lightning, keeping watch over the clover and corn. There's a songbook on the sidewalk that looks like a leaf, a maple, blazing red with a fiery rim of orange and gold near its elegant edges, delicate, fragile, the page of a hymnal turning and blowing in the breeze. There is a pew in the yard that looks like a rock, a sprawling block of granite, pinkish gray with silver flecks of mica, solid, inviting, an anchor. Children sit on its flat, sloping surface, waiting for the bus to stop. When I do not have the strength to face the sadness that wells up inside me, when the feeling that I am beaten or the fear that the world is broken rushes over me like a white cap of grief, I go to the clearing and ask the sun and the tree and the rock for forgiveness, for grace. There is incense in the air that smells like the autumn night, fields turning, dry and crisp, flowers on their knees, taking their last breath, awaiting resurrection.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So thank you for sharing that. We'll go back to questions. Yes.
I, of course, was privileged to hear your poem at the Proteus event and interested because the poem you just read reminds me a little bit of a rock, a tree, a stone by the great late Maya Angelou. How would you describe writing a cultural experience, something that is based on your culture that you are trying to share with your audience, much like you did at the Proteus event?
Well, I think it's a heavy responsibility. And so when I'm trying to write something like that, either about my heritage or about the world that I'm living in, I try very hard to release any expectation and to just let the feelings and the words come out, because otherwise it can just be a weight, a weight to try to speak for others or think of what you need to say versus what's coming from your heart. And I think that's the job of the poet is to let things come from our heart that hopefully reflect or provoke thought. So that's a very vague answer, I think, but that's how I would go about it. Mhm.
Maybe to pick up on that, and I'm not sure if this is exactly what you meant, but nowadays there's this phrase misappropriation of culture, and so what if somebody asks you to write something and it's, let's say, an Asian wedding or an Asian, or a culture that clearly you're not, and you kind of, I'm just, let me put myself into a situation where I'm asked to speak at a funeral and it's a different culture, and my tendency is to want to say something that would be culturally relevant to that culture, but now I'm afraid that as a white guy, I might, in trying to go overboard, be misinterpreted as to be getting outside the lane I should be in. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
Oh,
The question I'm asking?
Yeah, completely. And I think I would be very, very careful if somebody asked me to write a poem representing a group that I am not a part of. I think I could share what something looks like through my own lens,
Mhm.
but that's why I really like often writing about trees and flowers and pastures, right?
Right.
Because they're
They're in every
often
culture.
metaphors, and you
Yeah.
can use nature or use the world around us to try to reflect some of those feelings. Mm-hmm.
Good. Thanks.
Hi.
Angelina.
I wrote several poems, and it's an interesting experience because when I'm meeting with a music therapist, which I really love doing, is learning to give up some of those words to turn them into lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
Poems and lyrics are totally different. Because when you do a poem, there could be long sentences, and she goes to make the chords go and the beat go, and she goes, "How willing are you willing to give some of those words?" Like, wait, okay, and it is hard. But when you work with somebody who knows how to do lyrical writing, it's really goes, because it did flow. The music flew with it, and it had the same meaning, but just in a different way. Have you ever felt to do an approach with any of your poems that way, in a music way?
I wrote a poem. I wrote a song last year where I had a songwriter and I wrote the lyrics, and I experienced that very same thing, that the way it looked on the page, it wasn't going to work with the music. You had to cut it down, simplify, and I think I had to have a little conversation with myself about letting go of some of the phrases that I had loved, but it's about a different art form. So those words have to flow and fit a different way. It was a wonderful learning, really fabulous. I hope you keep writing more songs. Yes.
Thank you.
So I have a quick question for you, and it's building upon the previous question of marrying that to music. You see all these rappers. Do you think that rapping is actually poetry?
I absolutely do. I think any use of words and language that conveys meaning that isn't just back and forth speech is a form of poetry. Any singing, rapping, 100% valid. And if you've ever tried rapping, it's a really difficult form of poetry that just is flowing out of people. It's amazing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Intricate rhymes and rhythms and.
But some people like listening to rap and some people don't. Some people like listening to limericks and some don't. So, different things fall on our ears. Even Shakespearean poetry, which people consider, well, that's poetry. Well, I mean, I know a lot of 8th graders who would never want to be subjected to that, right?
Not another sonnet. This is just punishing.
Right, exactly.
Well, thank you, everyone. We could go on, and we definitely will have you back as a guest. This has just been wonderful. Susan DeVaca, who is a poet and is also the CEO of Business Corporation. And thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you. You're inspiring me to write more poetry that you could share.
I am going to hit you up for some copies of some of those. If you are watching us and you know someone that would benefit by watching this program, you'll be pleased to know that this program will be available on demand beginning tomorrow at the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel, and it will also be available on demand at the Mercy Cancer Center website. I hope you'll join us again next week. Thanks, everyone.